ahead and get started. Perfect. Okay, so as folks probably know, this is an RFP webinar for the Regional Climate Collaborative's rounds 1 and 2 application assistance. And so next slide, please. Today, we are going to just do a kind of quick overview of the background of the RCC program. Just a little bit. We also have guidelines out that we would like to share. We'll share links in the chat if you haven't already been able to take a look at those. Sorry, doing some live tech stuff while I am presenting, but I will keep going in just a second. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time today on the purpose of the RFP, the desired qualifications and scope of work, and evaluation criteria, as well as give some detailed information on what needs to be included in the bidder response package and those proposal components. And then we'll end with Q&A. That will include both the information on questions that we've answered already from folks who have written in with questions, as well as time to answer any of your questions that you have here today. So I wanted to pause real quick. I know we're having some tech issues internally with the team to see if folks need to switch things around at all, or if we can just keep moving. Okay, I'm gonna keep.
We're good.
Awesome, thank you, Kieran. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep moving through to the next slide, please. Wonderful. So we have, fortunately, here with us today, our Senior Contracts Manager, Blake Deering, who has to hop off a little early. Typically, we have him at the end, but to make sure we can get his time, wanted to save some time right at the beginning to hear from him on a couple of questions that have already been answered, and then, or that we've received and that he has answers ready for. If folks have any others really specific contracting questions that he can answer, would love to get those now. We will also have some time for Q&A at the end, and if you've already written in questions and Blake doesn't respond to those, we still have those answers, so we'll cover those at the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Blake.
Thank you, Coral. Hi, everyone. Again, as Coral mentioned, my name is Blake. I'm the Senior Contracts Administrator with the Strategic Growth Council. And there was a couple questions regarding the resulting contract of this RFP that I just wanted to touch on. One question was around budget. There was concern whether subcontractors have to be identified within the budget for their proposal. The answer is yes, you do have to identify the subcontractors. That is extremely crucial to allow us to fairly evaluate proposals against the other competitors. There is also small business and DVBE preference and incentives that are associated with this RFP. Those are socioeconomic programs. They're discussed throughout the RFP, but essentially, in order for us to fairly score, it's measuring a factor of whether that small business or that prime, whether that subcontractor or that prime is a certified small business or DVBE, and that plays into effect how many points are going to be associated when we are scoring them. So we cannot score proposals that have TBD listed for their subcontractors. They have to identify a subcontractor as well as a dollar amount. The dollar amount does not have to be precisely exact, but it should be pretty close to what you expect to spend with that subcontractor. There was another question in regards to budget as far as revising budgets after we have resulted into a contract. So once we've resulted into a contract, we've awarded a contract to the entity. If there is need to adjust that budget, we have the ability to do so within a certain scale. So that's either within 10% or 10,000. If it's greater than 10% or $10,000, then we do have to do a formal amendment. This RFP once we do have an intended awardee for a contract, it does go to the Department of General Services. They issue their final review and approval. And so if we do go through a formal amendment process down the line for that contract, it will also involve DGS for their final review and approval. So to every degree, we want to avoid amendments when we can. But if there is a shift in funds for that contract and it's below 10% or below 10,000, then we could simply do a budget revision. And that process simply involves the contractor submitting a request to program staff, and that will include the revised budget that's being proposed, as well as a justification as to what is changing and why. If everything checks out, then we could go ahead and proceed to implement that newly revised budget, and we don't have to go the formal amendment process. The other concern was around invoicing, on whether that would be a monthly or quarterly basis, or if it's done after each deliverable is completed. We give you the option to either bill us monthly or quarterly. So it is not based on the completion of deliverables. It is based on how much you have completed for that deliverable. So for example, if you have task one, and you're billing on a monthly basis, and for the month of March, you contributed 100 hours towards task one, but task one is not completed, you would not bill us for the entire task one, because that may come off as it being completed. So instead, you would just bill us for that 100 hours against the classifications that are identified in the budget, if that makes sense. So we do give you the option for monthly or quarterly, because we do recognize, there are some small businesses and DBEs involved, and having the option to bill monthly seems may be more appropriate for some of those smaller entities. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on those two questions, as well as open it up for anybody else if they have questions right now regarding a resulting contract or the RFP itself. We did issue out a revised version yesterday. I'm not sure if either of you received notification on that, but essentially there was just a few typos. There was a typo on page 1. There was also a typo in the key dates table. It had mentioned the deadline was Friday, April 5th. But that was incorrect. Actually, April 5th is a Tuesday, so that was corrected, as well as the minimum qualifications. The minimum qualifications is on, I believe, page 26. Yes, 26. And it was a little contradicting, because it spelled out at least 3 years of experience, but then in parentheses it had the number 4, and that was for all of the bullets there. So we corrected that to ensure that all of those say 3 years experience for those criterions. One other thing that I wanted to highlight on is the scoring. This scoring section, I touched a little bit on it earlier in regards to socioeconomic programs. So this specific RFP is requiring participation of either small business for at least 25%. So that could be either the prime, it could also be the subcontractors, and collectively, if you had 5 subcontractors that added up to be 25% or more, or you could have a minimum of 3% DVBE participation. And so that is a requirement. We are obligated through various statutes and government codes that we have to meet on an annual basis. All of our dollars have to be spent 25% with a small business, as well as 3% with a disabled veteran business enterprise. So those, as far as scoring goes, you can receive additional points based on those preferences and incentives. There is a total of 100 points for the technical piece of scoring, and a total of 50 points for the cost piece. And so when we go through, when we score for the technical and the cost, that subtotal, we're going to evaluate the prime contractor, whether they're certified in either small business or DBE, as well as all of their subs, and determine that, and we're going to verify that total percentage if it amounts to either 25% or 3%. If it does, then that entity is going to get that preference or incentive applied to their scores, which provides them a bump in their scores. So it is crucial to pay attention to that piece. ensure that you are working with a certified small business or DBE, because if we receive proposals that don't have that, they are not meeting that requirement where they have small business or DBE participation, then unfortunately we cannot review those proposals. So please pay attention to that section. If you do have any questions on that, you can reach out to us, and I could touch base with you either via email or on a phone call. And yeah, again, the deadline for this is Tuesday, April 5th, 2022 by exactly 5 p.m. So that means it has to be received on our end by 5 p.m. So 5:01 is technically considered late. I cannot legally accept that proposal. It's illegal for me to do, and it would be unfair to everybody else who submitted their proposals on time. So just please be cautious of that. Please also be cautious of the attachments. There is attachments. Some of those are required. Specifically, the bidder declaration is the most crucial attachment, as well as the commercially useful function documentation is also the most important two attachments that are required to be returned. If your proposal does not have those two attachments, we cannot accept that. That really breaks down who are the subcontractors as a part of this agreement, and that they're actually contributing to a piece of the work for this project. And I've had RFPs in the past where that one, like the entire proposal seemed great, and we went through and did an admin check, and they forgot to include one of those forms, and I had to unfortunately eliminate them. And that specific RFP was almost a $2 million agreement. So please pay attention to when you are about to submit. You ensure that one, you are not submitting close to the deadline, and two, you've went through all the attachments and made sure that you've included what's required. And again, just to echo what I mentioned before, is it does have to be received on our end by 5 p.m. I get quite a bit of proposals that are submitted very close to the deadline, and I understand, folks want to ensure that their I's are dotted and their T's are crossed, but it does have to be received by 5 p.m. If it's sent on your end by 4:59 and it comes to me at 5:01, I legally cannot accept it. So just wanted to highlight all of those things and open it up if anybody has specific questions regarding some of those things.
Yeah, hey Blake, this is Kieran. There's a question here about proving small business certification, and two questions. One is, and I'll read this one. How can one prove small business certification given that the state website doesn't download a very useful certification forms? It appears to download a web page, but it is in Excel format, so it's hard to display. And then I guess the broader question is just like, is there a formal process around proving small business beyond like a certain set of metrics around size of organization?
So in order to become a certified small business or DBE, they actually have to go through a process with the Department of General Services to become certified. When they're certified, they get placed on what's called the California e-procurement website. So it's the same website that this RFP solicitation is being advertised through. And within that website, you can search by utilizing the quick links. You could search for certified firms, and you could search by either their name as well as their certification number. So if we receive on our end, if we receive a proposal and the proposer has properly filled out the bidder declaration, the commercial useful function forms, it asks for those certification numbers. So we do a check on our end, and the proposer could do that as well. If they have an entity that is trying to partner with them, ask them for their proof of certification for small business or DBE, and they should be able to provide you a certification ID number, and you could verify through this website that they are in fact certified. It'll tell you the current status, if it's expired and the date it expired, and what they're certified in, because some entities are certified for both small business or DBE. And then once we receive proposals, we go through to verify that information. So the subcontractors or the prime, if they are small or a DBE, they do have to be certified at the time of submission.
All right, thanks, Blake.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. So I think we got to the follow-up question that we're looking for the certification ID number, and SJC will verify that. Yes. Blake, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I heard you just say. And
Yes.
then, perfect. So, and then to answer the final question that's here in the Q&A, will the materials and attendee list be made available to participants in the pre-bid? I'm also entering this in case folks miss it, but yes, we'll provide the webinar recording and the slides, as well as the attendee list. Please let us know if you do not want your information shared on the attendee list, and we will remove you from that before we share it out. Want to see really quickly if folks have any other questions for Blake. And also wanted to let you know we'll go over the timeline, but there's still, after this webinar, still opportunities to ask us questions. But just saving this time since we're here live today, but we absolutely will be monitoring and watching for any questions sent in, and actually have some today. Okay, so with that, I think that I'm not hearing any other questions, can move over to Kiran Kumar, Deputy Director at SGC, to talk about the program overview and some of the scope of work and qualifications that we are wanting to see.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks, Coral, for kind of live teching in the background, and Blake for answering some of the questions, or at least preempting some of the questions that may be coming up around the actual submittal of this RFP. I'm going to kind of go through the bulk of both a program overview of the RCC grant program, and then also jump into talking about, of course, this request for proposal. And then just sorry for folks that you're not able to see me. It's a Zoom setting thing. So just quickly to summarize the program origins, the Regional Climate Collaborative, or RCC program, was established by Senate Bill 1072 in 2018. And we did just only receive the program funds in the 2021 budget, which is why we've developed the draft guidelines now and are going through that process. The overarching goal laid out in statute really is to assist under-resourced communities within a region to access statewide public and other grant funding for climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience projects, with a focus on centering community voice and driving community and region-wide strategies. So it's both supporting communities and accessing dollars and kind of putting that pipeline in place, but really doing so with community at the forefront of that and building capacity along the way. So in the first year, we have roughly 8.35, call it $8.5 million in RCC funding, with proposed award amounts ranging from between $500,000 to $1 million, allowing us to fund between 8 and 16 collaboratives in this first round. And the grants will all have 3-year award terms. Next slide, please. So again, not to confuse, I want to be clear that right now I'm still talking about the Regional Climate Collaborative Grant Program itself and the objectives for that program. I'll get into the request for proposal that supports this grant program in just a moment. So while statute clearly defines eligible activities and applicants, it doesn't really define the overall program objectives. And so the objectives that you see here on the slide are really tied to the listening sessions and listening work that we had done back in the fall, really trying to understand the outcomes that folks hoped collaboratives would achieve utilizing this grant funding. So the first one is developing actionable plans and projects, so focused on ensuring that the grant proposals would lead to the development of local plans, strategies, and projects that can actually be implemented, which really to us feels like the underlying goal of the program. Second is building social infrastructure, and really just that applicants and collaboratives are showing how activities within their work plans would build relationships that are endearing and trusting across members of those collaboratives. And this really emerged within our listening sessions as a common barrier in trying to collaborate on grant applications and other initiatives at the local level, particularly in a way that enables community prioritized projects to be funded. Third, centering community engagement and decision-making. We really want to ensure that this work is conducted alongside and in partnership with the residents of the communities that grantees will be focusing on. We touch on this in different parts of the guidelines themselves, but an important piece to note here is that the collaborative should be thinking about what organizations and possibly individuals need to be part of the application in order to make sure that this goal can be achieved. And then finally, we have developing equity-centered processes. One thing that we've heard quite strongly was that best case scenario for this grant program would be to shift the way that projects are developed and implemented, so that community-based organizations, residents, and other non-governmental or institutional groups have shared decision-making power in projects that are going to impact them. And a lot of this, if you are familiar with the model, comes from the Transformative Climate Communities Grant Program. And so if you're interested in further background on kind of what is informing this grant program, that's a great place to start. And then one thing I just want to really note before moving on is that we're expecting grantees to demonstrate how they'll achieve each of these objectives through the application that they put together and submit. And so this is where the technical assistance that you would be providing is so important. So with that, let's go into the RFP in the next slide. So with nearly all programs at the Strategic Growth Council, we provide applicants with technical assistance to develop competitive applications and navigate the state grant writing process. We know that capacity building further upstream from the time of request for grant applications is also helpful in supporting under-resourced communities being able to compete for state funding. And so and then in addition to that, of course, we've also found it helpful for our TA providers to do the targeted outreach to communities to encourage folks to apply who may not have otherwise considered the opportunity. There's many organizations out there that are doing incredible work at the local level, but just don't see state funding as an opportunity for them. And we'd like to kind of shift that a little bit. And then again, this is why we're looking for teams with a strong reach across the state. This technical assistance, if you could go back. This technical assistance contract is for $300,000 and would be in place of both rounds of the RCC grant program notice of funding availability, or NOFA, and support applicants in applying to rounds 1 and 2. And then additionally, the contract would include capacity building, first at a high level early on in round 1, and then a little bit more in depth between the awarding of rounds 1 and 2. And then finally, I want to just be clear on language. I've used the term NOFA already. For the grant program window for applicants, we use the term NOFA and RFA, or request for applications. And then for contracts, like the one we're talking about today, we use the term RFP, or request for proposals. Next slide, please. So the scope of work is broken out to be as straightforward as possible for respondents to the RFP. There's 5 primary tasks. So task 1 involves all administrative tasks related to the implementation of the scope of work, pretty straightforward. Task 2 involves program outreach to support awareness building of the program prior to or around the time of the NOFAs for both rounds 1 and 2. So here we're looking for a straightforward but effective communication strategy for reaching communities and organizations throughout the state who would ultimately benefit from participating in the grant program. Tasks 3 and 4 are both nearly identical and involve all tasks related to the provision of application technical assistance for rounds 1 and 2 respectively. I should also mention, and it was a question that came through, that right now SGC only has funding for 2 rounds of the program. Should that change, we would likely release a second RFP for further technical assistance to support that. But right now we're just focusing on rounds 1 and 2 of the grant program. Activities that are included but are not limited within the scope of direct application assistance include meeting with potential applicants, answering technical questions around the guidelines, helping to facilitate the development of the collaborative stakeholder structure using best practices around collective impact, coalition building, collaborative governance, things like that. So, and then supporting the development of the work plan and budget to really be aligned with program goals. And then also, one thing that we're excited for as we kind of come out of the fully remote environment is to support preparation for site visits during the selection process. We're still working on exactly what that would look like, but we are anticipating having site visits as part of the kind of scoring and selection process for the grant program. And then finally, task 5 involves capacity building for rounds 1 and 2. And so, as I said before, we're anticipating that this will look differently across both rounds. So in round 1, the capacity building will take the form of developing and sharing best practices, strategies, frameworks, and other helpful tools and materials to help applicants align themselves with program goals and then begin the process of forming their applications. And then between awarding of grants in round one and then NOFA for round two, the capacity building will be a lot more hands-on and kind of more in-depth with both previously unsuccessful grant applicants from round one, as well as new potential applicants to the program. SGC will facilitate the process to identify those recipients of round two capacity building. And then within that, some of the tasks that we're envisioning are hosting workshops and coordinating local partners, potentially developing and sharing webinars, developing and hosting trainings, and then coordinating in person and or remotely with potential applicants, really to better understand the program and then the opportunity to build out a competitive and realistic work plan. Okay, next slide. Okay, cool. There we go. So we're looking for bidders with a variety of experience and skills or skill sets to support this dynamic program. And because of that, we are encouraging a team approach, but we're not requiring it. So the following are minimum qualifications for applicants, or I guess I'll talk through them. But throughout the document, we've also included other notes on qualifications and expertise that we're looking for. And so some of those are summarized in the slide here, but just on the minimum qualifications, we're looking for at least 3 years of experience providing TA and proposal grant writing, at least 3 years of experience in community development, 3 years of experience working with coalitions or involvement in grassroots and community-centered collaboratives, at least 3 years of experience coordinating public, private, and nonprofit organizations, or at least serving in a project management role with those entities, 3 years of experience building capacity with under-resourced communities, and then finally 3 years of direct experience working with under-resourced communities, including unincorporated communities in California Native American tribes, with a focus on promoting health and racial equity. That sounds pretty comprehensive, but I think it's important to note that we are looking for these qualifications across the team, and we're leaving it up to you all to kind of describe how the team meets those qualifications. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll end with evaluation criteria. I think we've got 2 more slides. So the RFP bids will be scored on 2 factors. So one criteria is related to the scope of work, approach, and team. And then another more technical one is based on budget and cost. And because it's a little bit more dynamic, I'm going to spend more time talking about the technical evaluation criteria, which is scored out of 100 total points. So there's 5 points for clarity and organization of proposals. That's from a kind of a readability organization standpoint of the proposal. But then the bulk of the points are awarded between a few other categories, including the approach to the scope of work, with either 10 or 15 points awarded across 3 categories there. And you can see those on the slide. And then we have 15 points for the overall work plan, schedule, and budget justification. And then within that, we'll evaluate the feasibility of strategies that are being proposed, the sensibility of the budget breakdown, and then the schedule. Next slide. And then finally, another 40 points across 7 or so domains related to the bidder and team's experience and our estimation of their ability to successfully deliver on the scope of work. And so here's another place where you can look for some of those qualifications we're looking for from the team beyond just minimum qualifications. Okay, I think that does it for my overview of the RFP. If we could go to the next slide, we'll just check though. Yeah, okay. Coral, I'm going to turn it over back to you to kind of talk through some of the more technical components of responding to an SGC RFP.
Perfect. And I did want to point out, Kieran, that there is one question in the Q&A that we can either answer live, but if you'd like to answer in the chat, feel free to, and we can also cover again during the Q&A portion.
Actually, yeah, why don't I answer that question and a question earlier. So the question from earlier is if if we are allowing stipends for participants in the program, and then if the folks receiving stipends would need to be named. We are not envisioning and I'll qualify this in a second, but we're not envisioning the need for stipends as part of this TA contract, insofar as we're providing technical assistance directly to entities who would be applying to state funds. And so we would want to avoid any sort of kind of confusion around being paid to develop applications or conflicts of interest. That being said, we are very supportive of the idea of participant support and stipends, and we've built that in as part of the RCC grant program itself, which is exciting. But just a note that we're not expecting the need for the TA provider under this contract to be providing stipends to folks. Let us know if you've got something else in mind there, and I'm happy to talk through that moving forward. And then I see a question from Stephen. Why does the RFP require the contractor to assist SGC in outreach to the communities to apply for the RCC grants? SGC isn't a collaborative meeting grant application requirements. I'm not sure I understand the second qualifying part of that question, but the reason we've asked for folks to support in the outreach is that it's just sometimes helpful at the time of the NOFA for a third party affiliated and associated with SGC to be doing some additional outreach around this program.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on point, Kieran, and would just additionally add that while we're not under legislative requirement to do kind of thorough outreach, I think it's really important to us to model the kind of process and behavior that we'd want our actual grantees to be going through in terms of really doing due diligence to try to reach communities who we might not have relationships with or those connection points with. And so doing the extra work to kind of build those relationships and find those folks we think is beneficial for both this program and for our work in general as the state. So I will now go over the required components for when you're actually putting together your proposal and responding to the RFP, and then how it should be organized as well. Next slide, please. So this slide contains all the components that you need to include in your proposal, and I'll dive deeper into some of the kind of more substantive pieces momentarily. And then just wanted to note that there's more information in the RFP as well, especially around some of like the formatting requirements, which I'll actually also answer during the Q&A. And then do want to note that this part is really, really important because forgetting to include some of these components could result in disqualification or substantial loss of points. And we really want to be able to consider all the responses that get submitted. So that's why we're going over these in such detail today. Next slide, please. So to just kind of dive more into the scope of work, which is where a really substantive large part of the proposal will be. This slide details kind of specifically what needs to be there. Starting with a summary, we're asking that you provide an overview of the project that is less than 1 page. Also a project management plan that has the management structure of the team, including the subcontractors. We'd like to specifically see the project manager be named in there with at least a title, kind of position, and the organization that will be really taking the lead there. Again, that's on managing the project, not on anything more detailed about having to do every single task. Then there's methodology and approach. So wanting to see how folks identify techniques and methodologies in responding to the scope of work, as well as any specific administrative and operational management expertise that enables you to be able to kind of actually complete and manage the contract, my apologies. Then a budget justification that explains the proposed allocation of funds to each task. So there's $300,000 total over this 2-year roughly period. How are you planning to kind of divvy that up across tasks during that time period? Then a work plan and work schedule that identifies all tasks, milestones, and deliverables, that specifies estimated hours for each task, and then explains the supervision to ensure timeliness and task management. So just really wanting to see what the kind of more detailed reporting structure and management structure looks like in terms of specific tasks or subtasks. And then finally, subcontractors, having a description of each person or firm and the work to be done by each subcontractor is necessary. And then I'll also just remind you that the content Kieran just covered earlier, we are scoring for all of this, so it's important to put some thought into it as well. Okay, so for qualifications, we're looking for a few things. So first is proof of minimum qualifications. So we need to see the relevant work of proposed team members. You should be explaining how the proposal is like team is meeting each of the minimum qualifications, and to what extent any of the minimum qualifications have been exceeded. So a chance to actually emphasize those areas where it's meeting the goal and going even beyond it. And then also that asking that you submit all applicable documentation and work samples as appropriate. And then for personnel and team resumes, we want to see any key personnel, so especially thinking about the project manager, but others on the team as well that will be working on the project. That does include subcontractors. And are asking that you submit with that a table that shows how the minimum qualifications are met with assigned key personnel to each category of minimum qualification to just see how that maps across the board. And then are asking that both the lead and any subcontractors provide a reference form. That reference form kind of layout has space for 3 references on each one. We do need 3 references for each proposed team member. Next slide, please. So for the budget, please use the budget template, which is in the event package for the RFP on Cal eProcure. And so this slide includes additionally some information on costs that we might typically see in proposals and that help us to ultimately evaluate it. So this helps us to understand both kind of what's your approach, how you're allocating the funding across this time period, and then be able to evaluate that in the scoring that Kieran went over earlier. And then just as another reminder, the maximum amount available for this contract is $300,000 for the 2 application rounds for RCC with some capacity building built into the middle. So please plan your budget accordingly. Some important things to note are that you need to use CalHR travel and per diem expenses, which can be found at this site that I'll link to in the chat in just a moment. And something important to note there is that travel rates for hotels vary depending on your location. Okay, so that's in there now. Next slide, please. So this slide includes just an overview of all of the required attachments. This is also in the RFP, but like Blake mentioned earlier, please make sure to take a look at all these and ensure that you've uploaded them with your proposal. Otherwise, we may have to disqualify your proposal and not review it at all, which would be really just sad for everyone, I think. Next slide, please. So the RFP is out. Some important dates to note are that the final deadline for written questions is March 29th. If we get questions any later than that, we will try to answer them, but can't guarantee that we'll be able to respond before the deadline for submittal, which is on April 5th, like Blake mentioned earlier, which again is a Tuesday. And then we anticipate that we would go into internal review, post the notice of intent to award on April 11th, and then hope that we can begin the contract in early May, which is around the same time that we'll be posting the application. And then I think finally taking a look here, we would be having the contract go through end of December 2023. The 29th is a Friday and the 31st is a Sunday, which is why it's just a little before the end of the year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're moving into the question and answer period. We have some that were submitted before this webinar that we'll go over first, and then answer any remaining questions that folks have after seeing if we've covered them there. Next slide, please. So like Blake mentioned, there are a few typos in the original RFP. We did revise it and submit or upload a new one to Cal eProcure. So if you go back into Cal eProcure, those have been corrected. That is, there's a typo in the title. The years of experience required, again, that is 3 years of experience required in each of the minimum qualifications. And then the due date is Tuesday, April 5th, which I think is important. We wouldn't want any of those to slide in on the wrong date. Then a question about formatting requirements, such as font type or margin size, and whether there's a max page length. So there's no max page length, and we ask that you please use a readable font and margin size so that our reviewers can review without straining their eyes too much. We do ask, and this is in the RFP, that all pages of the proposal, including cover pages, table of contents, and references, have the business name, RFP number, and page numbering format in the upper right-hand corner. Then a question around when the final guidelines will be out. So we will post the proposed final guidelines to our website on April 18th, and then take them to our council 10 days later on April 28th. What's really important to note is that the council could make changes before adopting them, so it isn't officially final until April 28th, but we are hoping that the April 18th version will remain relatively unchanged, if not fully unchanged. And then a question around the specific month and day anticipated grant proposal deadlines in June and August of this year and of next year for the grant application due dates and the final application due dates. We do not have that set yet. There are a lot of different factors kind of internally that we need to go through to figure out when we would be able to post those. So apologize. I know it would help to have some specificity, but we are very much building the plane as we fly it with this program and trying to get out guidelines at the same time as TA. Ideally, there would be a buffer, but in order to get the funds out as soon as possible, we have to do it this way. So appreciate your bearing with us on that. And then Blake covered some questions around the budget and invoice, but a reminder that we do need that kind of detail on the budget in order to evaluate them. But there is an opportunity after the contract is finalized to adjust budget categories as long as it's less than a 10% shift. And then again, invoices can be sent monthly or quarterly depending on the preference of the contractor, but would need to be accompanied by some sort of deliverable. That can be a quarterly or a monthly report, or it could be deliverables stipulated in the contract that have been finalized in that time period. Next question that we received was, since we don't know everything that applicants will need, if the proposed team falls short of having someone with one or two of the bullet points under the experience requirements, will their application be rejected? So wanted to note here that we have designed the RFP largely based on what we've been hearing from potential applicants about the kind of support that they need to apply to the program. So it is really important that you're able to demonstrate the qualifications on the team that you're pulling together. We can't know ahead of time what all the needs will be or what percentage of TA will be required for each task. It's just impossible for us to predict ahead of time. And so we are just basing it off the information we have, and would say that we won't necessarily reject the RFP completely, but we'll likely be heavily noting that in the scoring process if you don't include those qualifications. So please keep that in mind before you apply. The next question was, is there a pre-qualified bidder list? So there's no pre-qualified bidder list. As Blake went over earlier, you need to be registered with the state as a contractor or possible contractor. Included that link on how to do that as a small business, how to register as a small business. And then Blake included the link on the kind of verifying your status in Cal eProcure. Next question was, are similar SGC TA RFPs expected for later RCC grant rounds? So we currently don't have funding identified in the state budget for future RCC grant rounds. We have no way to know whether the program will continue beyond these 2 years of funding that we do have allocated. But if we do, there will be additional RFPs for TA providers if that's something that we continue to hear from applicants is necessary. And then finally, will well-qualified unsuccessful bidders on this RFP be placed in a pool of vetted technical assistance providers that's made available to potential grantees who might want to seek out TA additionally during rounds 1 or 2 using non-SGC funds? So we don't currently have plans to do that. We will be providing through this contract some degree of TA to all applicants to the program, depending on need and number of applicants, but don't plan to release that list at present. Okay, next slide, please. So just following up with some additional questions before opening it up to all of you. First one, who on staff will be the lead on this TA program. So it might vary. The whole case team will be involved. In the meantime, please get in touch with me. I'll include my email in the chat. And then even better is to continue to use the ta@sgc.ca.gov inbox. That's where anyone on our team will have access to and be able to kind of check updates for. Even if there's team turnover, for example, you'll still be able to get in touch with the team that way. Thank you, Kathleen. Appreciate that. And then the next question, will there be a bidders conference prior to the submittal deadline? So no, there will not, but we are holding this webinar today and recording it and posting it. Folks can also join our LinkedIn group for interested TA providers for any RFPs that SGC puts out. So we can provide some information on how to join that group. But that's a helpful way to potentially connect with others to see about forming a team. And then the next question is kind of getting into the next steps in our process for this program. So will there be 2 RFPs, one for application assistance, the other for implementation assistance? So yes, that is correct. We're releasing this RFP for application assistance for rounds 1 and 2, but we intend to release an additional RFP in the summer or the fall, seeking a team to provide implementation TA to round 1 RCC grantees to help them implement portions of their scope. And then got a follow-up questions on like what are the types of services we'll be looking for that. And I don't want folks in this webinar to get worried about that now. This is just because these questions came in that I'm covering them. But we're still developing the scope for what services those providers would be expected to be delivering. We currently anticipate that they would provide, though, at minimum, evaluation, peer-to-peer training, support, and then the process and function of working in and through a collaborative stakeholder structure. So some of that like coalition or collaborative management support. And we are currently thinking about releasing an RFI or request for information earlier in the summer to get a sense of the type of TA services that implementation TA teams might provide. So kind of opening it up to potential contractors to fill in the blanks a little before we put out an RFP. A question around when that RFP will actually be coming out. We anticipate it will be released within the next 6 to 9 months, likely again in kind of fall, maybe moving into winter, potentially, depending on the timeline for getting awards executed. The current plan that absolutely could change is to have awards adopted and then put out the RFP for implementation assistance based on the scopes of work that grantees will be implemented. And then finally, will we hold a bidders conference on the next RFP that we put out? We likely won't, like we have not for this one. This has not been a practice for SGC, but we're open to thoughts on this and examples of how other agencies have held these bidders conferences. We're just not familiar with them. So that was the end of the question and answers that we received through our email inboxes. But did want to note that we will be actually publicly posting those for those that are not as much auditory learners or want to go and revisit this information. It will be posted online so you can read those responses. Okay.
And Cora, we've got 2 questions, both from Lawrence in the Q&A section. One, if there are specific geographies or communities that we are prioritizing in the RCC program. And then, well, yeah, why don't we start with that one?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and absolutely is the answer. What's tricky is it's not like a specific geographic region of the state, like the Bay Area. We're focused on the Bay Area. We are focused on under-resourced communities, so that's defined in the RCC guidelines, and we go over it in our introductory webinar. I encourage you to take a look at that for more detail. But those are basically communities that meet some criteria around being either disadvantaged or low income, according to some screening tools that the state uses, and those communities that have had less success in accessing state climate mitigation grants. So really trying to think about communities that both have high need and high historic burden and impact from climate change and other kind of societal forces, and those that haven't received some of the funding that's come in, particularly from the state, thinking about the climate investments portfolio, and where there are all these grant programs for large infrastructure grants. So eligibility for the community for those communities is all over the state. There isn't a specific region or set of regions that those are based in, but those are the types of communities that we're prioritizing for this program. And then, yeah, so the projected number of applicants for rounds 1 and 2, what is that based on? I'll start with that. We are just basing that based off of like the conversations that we've had in our workshops, in talking through the kind of like requirements and expectations with folks in individual conversations that we've had, and anticipate that based on the current amount of engagement we're getting and folks kind of deciding to filter themselves out either for the first round or the second round, or deciding instead it makes more sense for them to go for a planning grant, for example, that's what we're basing it on. We absolutely do not have, there's not like a scientific process behind that, so we could be wrong. And then question around the budget and the stated desire to provide assistance to all applicants. What are our expectations for scaling assistance if we receive more applications? Yes, so if we receive a ton of applications, I think we will go, or intent to apply, I guess it would be that question. We will work with the TA provider to scale that, but I think one thing that we have built in is that there is this initial application where folks kind of state their intent, where they have some information on like the team they're planning to put together, the overall kind of vague scope and projects involved in their proposal. And at that point, we SGC staff would be able to work with the TA team to kind of provide advice to potential applicants on whether or not to move forward. It would be up to them. We're not disqualifying anyone. But the intention is to kind of help folks decide whether or not to apply, which I think will help whittle down the number of actual applicants we're providing direct application assistance to. And also want to note that prior to the kind of concept application or initial application, we're anticipating that the TA team will be providing less one-on-one TA and more kind of education and outreach about what the program entails, kind of broad workshops or resources on thinking about how to apply or considerations for applying.
Well, we have two, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just rolling through based on reading in the chat. Yeah, so Stephen, I mentioned this a little earlier, but the final guidelines, we intend to post the proposed final guidelines. So I'll take a step back. We are governed by a council of agency secretaries and members appointed by the legislature and the governor. And so before kind of finalizing any guidelines or awards or anything kind of critical like that, we have to take it to our council for adoption. There's a public meeting and public comment. And so whenever we post proposed final guidelines, they are just that. We can't say those are finalized because they still have to be voted on and approved by the council. So we'll be posting our proposed final guidelines on April 18th, and those will be finally adopted on April 28th. Again, subject to change if the council wants to change something that we put in our April 18th version for the April 28th version. And so next question is that if an entity is successful in getting an applicant assistance contract for the first RFP, is that entity precluded from applying or selected to be a part of the implementation TA contract? I'm curious to hear if you think differently, Kieran, but my initial response is no. There's no preclusion from being a part of implementation TA. What we would be really looking for closely is your capacity and ability to manage both projects at the same time. And then did also want to mention, I don't know if we brought this up earlier, that if you're applying to be a part of the technical assistance team to help folks design applications, that would mean you would not be able to be a partner on any applications coming in rounds 1 or 2. So even if you're not if you're saying like, well, I'm going to be applying as part of this team, so I won't provide TA to that team, that still won't work. We need a very, very clear line of separation there.
Yeah, I would confirm that there's no preclusion. We would just be looking at the capacity of that individual organization and their partners to provide the robust implementation technical assistance. And then I just wanted to underscore a couple of things. And actually, Sarah, Kathleen, if anybody's on the call, it would be helpful to drop in the LinkedIn link. Otherwise, we'll include that in the follow-up email. It's a kind of LinkedIn group for our TA, like known TA providers to potentially connect with one another, because SGC ourselves were unable to kind of form teams for these RFPs. Just one thing I wanted to underscore that Coral had mentioned is that we are anticipating a 2-phase application process for the RCC grants. That's because we are aiming to get this money into the hands of pretty under-resourced and low capacity community-based organizations, and we want to avoid them having to go through the onerous process of submitting an application only to find that they were ineligible from the start or missing a key component. And so that 2-phase application process, where folks will submit kind of an intent and a quick summary of their program, will help us, one, understand how many folks are potentially applying, and then 2, better direct our TA providers to provide the assistance. And then we're also, and this is included within the RFP, understanding that not every single applicant is going to receive the same level of technical assistance. Some applicants may need a little bit more, and so that'll be subject to availability and capacity of the TA providers. But SGC will be kind of intaking those requests and then working with the TA program to kind of go forth and engage more directly with those potential applicants to the RCC program.
Wonderful. And Kieran and everyone, just wanted to note that I did add in the LinkedIn group in the chat. So please encourage you all to join that, and then also link to the TA listserv. So when we have announcements specific to our team, it could be draft guidelines, or it could be RFPs. We do post a number of RFPs from our team. We'll be announcing it through that listserv, so I encourage you to sign up if you're not already on it. So we are just about at time. If anyone has any last questions, we are happy to take those. Otherwise, we can let folks get on with their day. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here today, and again, for bearing with us as we're putting out this RFP at the same time we're finalizing guidelines. We know it's not an ideal process, and are just grateful to you all for your potential creativity and thinking through how to respond to this. So like Kieran mentioned, we can support communities across the state that really, really need these resources in order to build climate resilience. So with that, I think we will end today's webinar. Again, please feel free to follow up with us on anything and send your questions in by March 29th. And we're looking forward to reviewing your proposals after April 5th at 5 p.m. Okay, and then yeah, we'll be sharing out the list here today. Okay, thanks all. Take care.